as we go. So I'd like to start by thanking everybody for staying with us until the end. And my special thanks go to Dr. Olga Dragoy, who has kindly agreed to give a keynote presentation at this conference. And I'd like to say a few words about our speaker. Olga, I think originally is a linguist or a philologist in Russian terms, with a background in theoretical linguistics and later in clinical linguistics, having done basic education, receiving a master degree at Potsdam, followed by a PhD or a candidate degree back at home. Dr. Dragoy on Literature Horizon was focused on aphasia, physiology, and specific deficits that aphasic people exhibit in terms of syntax and other properties. But what strikes me first about Olga is genuine, keen interest to different sides of the language function. And we discussed so many different things and thought of so many different projects. And you've moved to other areas, not just the physiology, but also other areas of connectivity. This is something we are going to hear more about today. And Olga is a very successful, so to speak, young senior scientist. We're heading a big and successful center for language and brain at Higher School of Economics. And today she will speak to us about language pathways and white matter tracks in language processing. Thank you very much, Olga, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yuri, for such flattering introduction. I'm very happy that I finally managed to join you, at least in this online format. I really hope that this year I would be able to come to St. Petersburg to meet all of you in person, but yeah, other forces interfered with my willings. I'm pleased and happy to share with you today my thoughts and kind of summary about the contemporary state of language anatomical models, and as well as to share with you the recent findings coming from our own center. And as the title states, I will talk today on language white matter, about white matter pathways supporting language as a higher cognitive function. And I would like to start right away from the focus of my own view and the contemporary common view on language, which is considered as a network-based function. And of course, I would like to mention the classic anatomy of language, and not to show that broken Wernicke are dead, but to probably revive the forgotten notions the classics introduced. So as most of you know, the classic anatomy of language includes several central notions, anatomical notions, as the Broca and the Wernicke areas, and the link, the anatomical connection between them, which is the acute fasciculus. And as the history goes, in the most of these findings were announced and published in the second half of the 19th century, although there is, some of you know that there is some debate about the Broca's area and the debate between Paul Broca and Mark Dux, who stated that, whose son stated that his father described the Broca area and its major features 30 years before Paul Broca. But Paul Broca is a renowned figure whose name is in this area, and who is always remembered in relations to the motive aspect of language. With his name, the posterior third of the inferior frontal gyrus is related to the seat of the ability to articulate language. And already at this point, I would like to make it very clear that Paul Broca talked about articulation, not about syntactic abilities as we do nowadays. So literally, he described this type of aphasia, which was further named with his name, as the loss not of the memory of the words, nor the action of the nerves, meaning that the deficit is neither the core linguistic, for example, syntactic, nor peripheral. It is a particular faculty to articulate language, which is lost, he said. So no articulation was possible in his famous patients. A decade later, Carl Wernicke described the posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus as the seat of auditory word images. And he was his probably the second important contribution to the language model at that time was that he clearly described the link, the anatomical white matter link between the Wernicke and the Broca area, which is the acute fasciculus. And a little bit later, Ludwig Lichtheim summarized these findings and clearly articulated a revolutionary at that time integral model of neuroanatomical pathways supporting language, communication, and as communication among brain regions. And that was very important because that was basically the first language-related clear articulation of functional specialization. Later on, this model is known as, in different versions, as Broca-Wernicke-Lichtheim or Broca-Wernicke-Lichtheim Geschwind model. Geschwind joined this company a little bit later, a century later, in fact, and summarized it again, put new life into the model, made it very wide known and common, but simplified it. And a lot of very important notes of classics were forgotten at this point. So the classic anatomy of language, as Geschwind described it in 1979, was characterized by limited spatial precision. So the even Broca and Wernicke areas were described not very clearly. But the model also was characterized by high functional modularity. So it was clearly stated that only those specifically mentioned areas are relevant for language and the link between them. This model, this form of model suffers from a few very important drawbacks. First of all, it doesn't account at all for language complexity. As the linguists who are present here, and also the psychologists and other people from other specialities who deal with language, of course, know that language is a multi-layer phenomenon. So this model took language as language in general. It didn't differentiate between layers of language, that is phonological, lexical, syntactic, discourse, very important layer. This is the way how we actually communicate. And the findings from the recent decades clearly indicate that broken Wernicke aphasias do not occur necessarily after the damage to those lesions. This is greatly summarized in the paper by Nina Dronkers in 2007. So basically, if a patient gets a stroke into her Broca area, she may get or not the Broca aphasia. And on the other hand, another patient with a damage outside Broca area can get the Broca aphasia. And at this point, I would like to get back to original writings, the classics. For example, Ludwig Liedheim wrote, oops, can you hear me?
Yes, everything works.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, pretty well.
Well, can anybody respond to me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Anna, tell me if you can hear me.
I can hear you, yes.
Great, because my earphone connection was lost for some reason. Okay.
We can hear you well.
Okay, great. So go on. So Ludwig Liedheim wrote, I do not consider the function to be localized in one spot of the brain. Seems very familiar to us now, but rather to result from the combined action of the whole sensorial sphere. So the classics who proposed this model already stated that it is not modular. On the other hand, Wernicke wrote that everything which goes beyond elementary physical functions is an achievement of the fiber tracts, which connect the different regions of the cortex to each other. So this is one of the first and very clear indications about the role of white matter tracts in the language system. So it's the model of language shouldn't be limited to cortical regions only. And here we switch to the modern state of the art. And there are different contemporary models of language. And there is one, I would say, a family of models, which is summarized in this slide. It is inspired by models of visual processing and is referred as dual stream model of language. So similarly to visual processing, in this model, the what stream and the how stream are stated, and in the visual domain, the what stream supports feature and object recognition, and the how stream supports spatial localization for movement coordination. And this metaphor and this philosophy is brought to the language domain. And the dorsal stream, which is here in red, is stated to support sensory-motor integration, and is stated to be involved and supporting language production, first of all. And the ventral stream, which is here in blue, is proposed to support speech comprehension. And yeah, there is a number of papers describing this model. So this is a more detailed scheme of the dual stream model of language. And you can see here the dorsal stream connecting the inferior parietal areas and the posterior temporal areas with the posterior frontal regions, both inferior and superior. And the dorsal stream is considered to be more lateralized in the language dominant hemisphere, which is left in most of people. And the ventral stream is more bilaterally organized, and includes acoustic processing, phonological processing, lexical retrieval, and semantic processing. And the ventral stream is also stated to be connected ventrally to the posterior inferior frontal gyrus. And yes, this is what I mentioned. So in the ventral stream, the authors included the following processing stages. So the superior temporal gyrus supports phonological processing, so acoustic and phonology, and the middle temporal gyrus and actually inferior temporal gyrus supports lexical access. And the temporal pole is responsible for integration of semantic information. And you can see that this is these stages clearly reflect the comprehension aspect of language. So we hear some acoustic signal, we access words, we process semantics. And the dorsal stream, which is more left hemisphere lateralized, includes sensory motor integration, and we'll discuss that a little bit in details further, which basically takes place in the angular gyrus. And then the information goes to the inferior frontal gyrus, the insular cortex, which is hidden here in between the frontal and temporal lobes, and premotor cortex, and which supports articulation for language. Right. And just to mention that both pathways are stated to interact with the distributed semantic network. I won't go in details regarding this, but it is related to the notion of distributed semantics, which basically is linked to our sensorimotor behavior and experience. There is basically vast evidence in favor of this dual stream philosophy and dual stream model of language. And just to mention, there is a recent meta-analysis of 11,000 fMRI experiments, and where the authors show language-specific components for the purely auditory task. And you can see here that this task highlights and causes the activation in the primarily in the temporal cortex bilaterally, clearly bilaterally, and equally bilaterally. Speech production induces activation in the superior temporal gyrus and posterior frontal lobe, both inferiorly and more superiorly. And it is bilateral, but we can see more activation in the left hemisphere. And the comprehension, which is a complex, actually language comprehension is a little bit more complex in terms of linguistic components than just audition, because it entails both listening, lexical access, comprehension of syntactic constructions, and also activates some frontal areas because of syntactic processing, because of sensory motor integration, and different kinds of motor stereotypes that can be induced by the semantics of what we comprehend. But the dual stream, the family of dual stream models of language are not specific at all in terms of actual anatomical pathways conveying this information and supporting the interaction between these cortical regions which are in the model. And but other people thought about that. And here we go to the associative white matter tracts of the brain, which are just one category of white matter pathways existing in the brain. They connect cortical areas and also subcortical gray matter nuclei within one hemisphere. Which means, but we do not include corpus callosum here, for example. They provide long distance associations, meaning that they connect different lobes primarily. Of course, every gyrus is connected to the next one, and these are so-called U-shaped fibers. They are not associated with white matter tracts. And this kind of white matter tracts are now considered as central elements in contemporary models of different, in fact, high cortical functions, including language. And this is what we're going to discuss today. So getting closer to language pathways, which you basically saw in this slide. So what I'm going to overview today is the arcuate fasciculus, which is already familiar to you, providing sensory motor integration and in particular phonological processing. It is here in red with its 3 segments. The frontal ascending tract, which is here in purple, supporting speech initiative and spontaneity. The inferior frontal occipital tract in purple, supporting semantic processing, and another system of ventral associative white matter tracts, the inferior longitudinal fasciculus in orange, which is more involved in lexical interface, and the answering fasciculus, which is which function is still difficult to tell for the moment, but it is believed to be involved to some aspects of semantic processing. So the arcuate fasciculus, and you can see already here that it's multicolored, and here is how we depict it. This is a convention. So historically, as I mentioned already, the arcuate fasciculus is a central language pathway. And it has 3 major areas of termination, which are the posterior inferior frontal cortex, the inferior parietal cortex, and the posterior superior temporal cortex. Please pay attention that that's already much more than just broken Wernicke areas. In particular, you can see here that 2 segments of the arcuate fasciculus considerably terminate in the so-called Geschwind area, which is superior temporal, inferior parietal. As I already introduced, one of the commonly accepted model states that the arcuate fasciculus has 3 major segments: the long, the direct segment, which is here in red, and you can see it here, and with the terminations in the posterior, primarily inferior frontal gyrus, but also some authors state that it terminates in the posterior middle temporal gyrus. And the temporal terminations include primarily posterior, middle, and inferior temporal gyrus. And again, please pay attention that this is not the classic Wernicke area. The Wernicke area is here in the superior temporal gyrus. And in my lab, we do a lot of tractography reconstructions, and very rarely we see the terminations of the arcuate fasciculus in the superior temporal gyrus. And the model also includes 2 other short indirect segments of the arcuate fasciculus: the anterior one, which is here in green, connecting the Broca territory, the posterior inferior frontal gyrus, and the Geschwind area, which I already mentioned. And the second indirect segment is the posterior one, connecting the same area where the long segment terminates, and the posterior part of the Geschwind territory. And here, how they come together. Already here, I would like to mention that this anatomy of the most studied language pathway, the acute fasciculus, is still an open question. We have questions about both prefrontal, about frontal and temporal terminations of the acute fasciculus. For example, for a decade, tractography was done with the so-called DTI, diffusion tensor reconstructions. And it has some drawbacks. And now we switch to more advanced modeling of tractography. For example, here I present the spherical, constrained spherical deconvolution model of the same long segment of the acute fasciculus, and this is the same subject, and this is the same data acquired in the same scanner. Just we use two different approaches to tractography to reconstruct this long segment, which results in quite different reconstructions, as you can see. So there is a question, an open question about the existence of this prefrontal, which you can see, as you can see, really go terminations of the acute fasciculus, which really go to the orbital cortex. And also there are questions about the temporal terminations of the acute fasciculus. For example, here you can see the that was 10 years ago already, and still we do not know where exactly it terminates. So here is the probability of temporal terminations of the AF. As you can see, it can terminate very close to the, even to the temporal pole. To find out, in an attempt to find out the real anatomy of the acute fasciculus, we go for ex vivo dissections. And actually, already nearly a century ago, the famous dissector Klinger showed, and this is just a picture from his book, 1935, showed how far to the prefrontal cortex the acute fasciculus goes. And here you can see the modern dissection from my Argentinian friend neurosurgeon. Here's the acute fasciculus with his several terminations in the premotor cortex, in the inferior frontal cortex, and also with prefrontal termination. So you can see that the anatomy is much more than we still consider. And I would like also to mention that in my lab, we do this kind of dissections, and we try to contribute to the anatomy of the acute fasciculus and hear how it goes. So basically we do manual dissections and then scan it. And then our, in an effort to make a 3D anatomy atlas in the end. So here, this is my own reconstruction. And here's the acute, this is the Geschwind territory. You can see the anterior segment coming here, the posterior, the long segment is below, and it extends to the prefrontal regions as well. Yeah, you need some experience to see that. So a few words about the development of the acute fasciculus. It is closely related to the language development, as you will see, as you see in this slide. So in newborns, only the pathway connecting the temporal regions, here's the newborn, the temporal region with the premotor, not the Broca area, not the inferior frontal gyrus yet, just premotor areas. So only this pathway is myelinated when you are born. And this is related to the Babylon period. and the known early learning of rule-based dependencies from auditory input. So I would say that this part of the acute fasciculus is the obligatory substrate, which is necessary for early language development, which is sensory motor integration in essence. So you hear something, you try to repeat, right? And you derive auditory rules from your auditory input. And and the blue connection, which you can see here and which is present in adults, is not even fully myelinated by 7 years old. It is there already, but it's not fully developed. And there are two sources of evidence suggesting that this blue part of the acute fasciculus constitutes and supports the fully fledged language, which we practice now, for example. On one hand, it is shown that adults accurately process syntactically complex sentences and activate this part, the Broca area, and the posterior portion of the superior temporal gyrus and sulcus during this syntactic processing. And on the other hand, children under the age of 7 do not process always correctly complex sentences, and this part of the acute fasciculus, as I mentioned, is not fully myelinated yet. Right. There is an interesting aspect of the acute fasciculus, which is its lateralization. So we'll focus now on the long segment of the acute fasciculus. So there is the overall prevalence of asymmetric distribution of the direct segment of the AF. So it's in most people, it's strongly left lateralized. And this is the seminal paper by Marco Catani, who was the first showing what kind of distribution there is in a human population regarding lateralization of the long segment of the acute. So 62.5% of his group had the long segment of the acute fasciculus only in the left hemisphere. Now we know that 13 years later that this result is partially a drawback of the DTI reconstructions they used at that time. So now when we do, in my lab, we've done like hundreds of reconstructions. And it is very rare when we do not see the right long segment of the acute fasciculus, even in clinical population. So this picture basically means that there is strong left lateralization in most of the people, but it doesn't mean that there is nothing here in the long segment on the right. It just means that it's very thin, and some tractography model doesn't allow to reconstruct it. So then there are two nearly equal groups with the bilateral but still left lateralized long segment and a symmetrical bilateral representation of it. This study was done in 40 right-handed individuals. Later on, basically the same result was got in people with both right-handed preference and with atypical handedness, ambidextrous or left-handed. And you can see here that it constitutes, this is the absolute numbers. So basically this is 81% of right-handed, and the same number of people with atypical handedness still have strong left lateralization of the long segment of the acute. And Importantly, it has been shown that there is a significant correlation of the lateralization of the acute fasciculus, the long segment, with language performance. For example, the same study showed that higher left lateralization of the acute fasciculus correlates with better vocabulary and complex ideation performance. Complex ideation is a subtest of a diagnostic test. This is basically comprehension of complex sentences in atypical handed people, and it is correlated with better semantic fluency in right-handed people. So this cohort is healthy people, but still language performance is variable in healthy people as well as in the clinical population, not that drastically, but still. The lateralization of the acute fasciculus predicts the language performance. The clinical data sheds some more light on functional specificity of the acute fasciculus. So the story started with the acknowledgement of a general contribution of the acute fasciculus for language, like again, language in general, to different aspects of language. For example, in this study, it has been shown that it is the acute fasciculus lesion load. These are stroke patients. The acute fasciculus lesion load size significantly predicts rate informativeness and overall efficiency of speech, as well as naming abilities. So all kinds of language aspect measures in this study. You can see it clearly here. So this is the AF lesion load. So 100% means 100 of acute fasciculus lesioned. And here you can see the words per minute and information units per minute, produced per minute. Both metrics are reduced the more the larger acute fasciculus is lesioned. On the other hand, here's going more to the specificity of the acute fasciculus. It has been shown that it is the AF focal lesions, so lesions exactly to the acute fasciculus, correlate with selective difficulties in repeating heard words, but do not correlate with word comprehension, picture naming, and verbal fluency. This behavioral linguistic pattern is representative for the conduction of aphasia. And here you can see where exactly the lesion was in this cohort of patients. In the same vein, in this study, they showed that damage to the acute fasciculus specifically causes impairment at the phonological level in different tasks. But as soon as phonology was involved, the language performance was reduced. So this data highlights the importance of the acute fasciculus for the non-semantic integration of auditory and motor speech processing, which constitutes the sensory-motor integration, which I have already mentioned. Similar support and similar data comes from intraoperative language mapping with direct electrical stimulation. And in this study, in this recent study by Johanna Sierpowska, our close colleague, it has been beautifully shown that the non-word repetition task is very sensitive, is basically the most sensitive task for during the acute fasciculus stimulation. It was compared with the word repetition task and with picture naming. And you can see here what went on during the operation when the neurosurgeon stimulated the acute fasciculus and the linguistic tested a patient with the non-word repetition task with the word repetition task and with picture naming. So here in black, you can see that this task was related to the most numerous errors. And at the post-operative stage, the non-word repetition was heavily impaired, and it was more impaired than other aspects of language. And here you can see in 2 patients, for example, in which the non-word repetition task didn't work well. And in picture naming, the phonological periphagias were induced, which is like another side of phonological processing in production. These 2 patients got severe deficit in non-word repetition after the operation. In addition to the same idea that the acute fasciculus supports sensory-motor integration and phonological processing in particular, this study strongly suggests that non-word repetition is exactly the task that should be used for intraoperative acute fasciculus mapping. What about the right acute fasciculus? Do we need it at all? We do. That's the current answer. There is a very, very interesting study published 6 years ago about the role of the right long segment of the acute fasciculus in post-stroke aphasia severity. You can see here in the graph the volume of the long segment of the right acute fasciculus and the aphasia quotidian, reflecting the overall aphasia severity in this cohort of patients. So the more the volume of the right acute fasciculus is, the less severe aphasia is. And here you can see 3 representative patients with very non-representative, acute fasciculus in the right hemisphere, and which is here on the aphasia quotidian scale. This patient has larger acute fasciculus and it behaves much better. And this patient with the very thick long segment of the AF in the right hemisphere had no aphasia at all. So this data highlights functional relevance of the right acute fasciculus, either for language in general, because we don't know if this is the result of the reorganization, post-stroke reorganization, or the initial state of the pathways in this particular individual, or it might reflect the genuine post-stroke reorganization. Okay. So the next white matter pathway, which is important for language and which is a focus of my own research, is the frontal ascending tract. So this is the long-ranged tract present in the frontal lobe. So it doesn't connect different lobes. It connects distant regions within the frontal lobe. And it has terminations in the posterior inferior frontal gyrus and inferiorly, and the supplementary motor area or pre-supplementary motor area superiorly in the superior frontal gyrus. It is identified both in post-mortem dissections and with diffusion tensor imaging. So there is no question that it exists. It is bilateral, and some authors state, like Marco Catani 8 years ago stated that it has left hemisphere dominance, but this is still an open question. We don't see in our data that it is lateralized. It's still a debate going on. So thinking about the function of the frontal ascending tract, we should get back to to its anatomy, because the anatomy itself suggests its functional contribution. So it connects the SMA, supplementary motor area, which is widely known for supporting behavioral planning and executive control, with posterior inferior frontal gyrus. I don't have to mention its role in language production. So the frontal ascending tract, is a direct connection between them. So one might think, and in fact people thought that, that a frontal ascending tract is a path allowing communication between general initiative and control, executive control, and language. And in fact, this idea was supported by some clinical data. For example, the fat damage correlated with reduced verbal fluency in patients with brain damage of different etiology, in stroke, tumor, and primary progressive aphasia patients. And there was no, before we did that, in the end, there was no the direct evidence for the causal role of the frontal ascending tract for this aspect of language. The intraoperative direct electrical stimulation studies showed non-specific contribution of the frontal ascending tract for language. For example, in these studies, the authors mostly used object naming and got different kinds of like non-specific, not very revealing language errors like speech arrest, delayed speech, perseverations, all variety of language errors one can get during electrical stimulation of the brain. So in some, the previous studies confirmed a language relevance of the left fat, but didn't show its functional specificity for speech initiation, spontaneity, and fluency, as it was predicted theoretically. So we decided to test that carefully, and thought that sentence completion could be a very good task to tap into the function of the frontal ascending tract for the following reasons. So when you comprehend the beginning of the sentence, the context, and have to complete the sentence with a word or two, you do active syntactic sequences and context-relevant lexical search. And this is like a true initiation of real propositional language. It is not the fully fledged language as I do now, but kind of spontaneous language in miniature. And from physiology, we know that it is exactly the inability to build a complete sentence, which is a core symptom of the so-called dynamic aphasia related to the frontal lobe damage. So we contrasted the sentence completion task with the action naming, like picture naming with depicted actions. And we had 12 neurosurgery cases with the pathology adjacent to the frontal ascending tract, which we checked on their individual tractography reconstructions. So the tasks were the following. For the action naming, like the standard linguistic intraoperative task, a patient had to say here what the hero is doing in a picture. Here sings, здесь поет in Russian, in one word. And in the sentence completion task, a patient had to read aloud the two words presented in the screen and complete with one word. Свинка жует траву, for example. And for those of you who are not aware with the intraoperative functional mapping procedure, this is a brief overview. So we usually following the 3A procedure, asleep, awake, asleep. When first for the access, the patient is completely sedated. And then she is awakened, and we do the neurosurgeon does direct electrical stimulation, usually with a bipolar stimulator, and a linguist does functional testing, linguistic testing. And every time the stimulation occurs with a linguistic error, we mark this piece of the brain with a marker, and then the neurosurgeon tries to not to resect it. That's not our business anymore. So this is how we considered the awake setup in theory. Before we did that, this is how it is in real life. And coming back to our study of the frontal ascending tract, here you can see the mapping results of our 12 patients. And here are those markers I mentioned. And so based on intraoperative photography or navigation, we identified those sites on MRI, preoperative MRI of individual patients. We found that in most positive sites, when a patient made errors in a linguistic task, there was a task dissociation. So a patient could name an action based on a picture, but couldn't complete the presented sentence, could read the beginning of the word of the sentence, but couldn't come up with the final word. And here you can see the distribution of the positive sites for both tasks. So the green sides are those specifically responsive for sentence completion here. And the blue sides, which are quite rare, are specifically responsive for verb generation, action picture naming, and the orange sides were those where the patient couldn't do both tasks. Since we had preoperative tractography for all of the patients, we overlaid the found positive sites on tractography reconstructions. And here what we found. All these sites specifically responsive for sentence completion were exactly on or in very close vicinity to the frontal ascending tract. And you can see here, the frontal ascending tract is in purple. You can see the variability of its anatomy in each individual patient. Of course, this is driven by pathology because these are mostly tumor patients, and the tumor can shift the tract to whatever side, to the front or to the back. And the frontal ascending tract with the classic anatomy between the IFG and the SMA, pre-SMA, may end up in the motor cortex or in very frontally in the prefrontal cortex. But every time the positive sites specifically responsive for sentence completion were exactly on the frontal ascending tract. And the second interesting finding in this study was what happened with this patient after the operation. As I mentioned, we just identified the positive linguistic positive sites, and then this is a medical business whether to resect it or not. And anyway, all those operations were done very close to the white matter tracts, and in some cases it was traumatized. So some patients, namely half of them, got some deterioration of some aspects of language, and when they got it, that was every time the discourse level, the level of spontaneous speech. And most of the patients recovered 3-6 months after the operation. And this raises another very interesting question about functional reorganization. So if we destroy or somehow damage partially the left frontal ascending tract, still most of the patients recover. So what happens? Does the right frontal ascending tract take over, or there are some other processes going on ipsilaterally? We still don't know. Right. So for the sake of the time, I will move further to the ventral language pathways, which are inferior frontal occipital fasciculus here, the inferior longitudinal fasciculus, and the ansonate. And some years back, actually the father of the still living father of awake craniotomies, the French neurosurgeon Hugh Dufour, proposed that these three tracts constitute two semantic pathways for language: the direct with the inferior frontal occipital, and the indirect, because there is a switch here in the temporal pole, with the inferior longitudinal and the ansonate fasciculus. So let's consider their specific functions. So the inferior frontal occipital fasciculus connects the occipital cortex and the frontal or the orbitofrontal cortex. It is, as basically all associative tracts, it is represented bilaterally, and as far as I know, there is no statement at the moment that it is left or right lateralized. And the electrical stimulation during awake craniotomies induces semantic paraphasias, meaning that instead of one word like cat, a patient produces another word, either semantically related or closely semantically related or distantly. So it can be dog or, I don't know, sofa. And its damage due to a stroke or neurosurgical resection leads to the impairment of semantic processing. And it is expressed both in comprehension and production. So this is why this pathway is proposed as the semantic pathway for language in general. The indirect semantic pathway proposed by Hugh Dufour includes the inferior longitudinal fasciculus and the ansonate fasciculus. And the ILAF has basically the same terminations in the occipital pole as the IFOF, and it goes to the temporal pole, to the place from where the ansonate fasciculus originate. So the temporal pole is considered as a switch point between the ILAF and the ansonate fasciculus. Both tracts are represented bilaterally too, as the IFOF, although for the ILAF there is an open debate whether it's still left lateralized or right lateralized, and you can see these two different opinions in these two papers mentioned. And the electrical stimulation of the ILAF and the ansonate fasciculus induce anomias, and which is considered as rooted in the dissociation between the visual image and semantics, picture-based, and a word to be retrieved. And also the stimulation of ILAF causes reading problems. We'll get back to that in the next slide. And damage of primarily the ILAF leads to difficulties in lexical semantic processing, both in comprehension and production. So it's not related to specific language modality. So among these ventral language pathways, the inferior longitudinal fasciculus is the most widely studied. Until recently, its function were inferred by pure anatomical reasoning. So it connects the temporal pole with the occipital regions, and they both are known to contribute to object recognition, and the symptoms observed when the ILF was damaged were visual agnosia, prosopagnosia, and alexia, so vision-related problems. So the functions of ILF were related primarily to the visual processing, and recently it was shown to be largely involved in semantic and lexical processing. This is why now it is considered as the pathway conveying lexical semantic interface. So there is some evidence supporting that it is involved in semantic processing and lexical semantic processing in particular. So again, thinking about the anatomy, the ILF provides the link to the anterior temporal lobe, the temporal pole, which is commonly accepted now in neurolinguistic as a transmodal semantic hub. So in patients with semantic dementia and semantic version of the primary progressive aphasia, in which the ILF is disrupted, we see semantic impairments. And then in healthy population, it has been shown that macrostructural properties of both ILF and the ancient fasciculus are predictive of successful novel word learning. And also the properties of the ILF were correlated with the richness of semantic autobiographical memory. These pieces of evidence are taken as supporting the semantic function of the ILF, and the lexical retrieval function of ILF is supported by postsurgical data. That is, after the surgery, the residual tumor infiltration in the left ILF was found to be a strong predictor of stable permanent impairments in naming. And in stroke patients, on the other hand, disruption of the left ILF was predictive of naming impairments for certain non-unique categories. And for those who are familiar with physiology literature, this is exactly those non-unique category deficits when a patient cannot name animals or fruits or some other entities from some other very specific semantic category. So this is related to the ILF damage nowadays. The ancient fasciculus is the least understood language pathway for the moment. The Neurosurgery Society is confident that they can safely remove the ancient fasciculus and it won't cause any behavioral consequences to a patient. But neurolinguists found out that its removal causes the impairment of naming of famous faces and objects. And this is exactly why famous faces naming is a very sensitive task for intraoperative mapping of the ancient fasciculus. So we basically present pictures, photos of famous people and ask to name them. But since the ancient fasciculus is intimately anatomically related to the limbic system, it is not clear whether we're talking about language, purely linguistic function, or about emotional component involved in this kind of tasks. So this all brings us to like a new model of language, which some call hodological mode of language, derived from the Greek word hodos, meaning path. So that's the model of language pathways and the critical role of them in the language processing. I would say that these are main postulate of this family of models And the first of which is that functions of specific pathways should be based in the quality of the transferred and interacting information. A great example of this is the frontal ascending tract, as I showed you. So it is the tract functionally connecting the language system and the executive control system. And so the function should be derived as providing this kind of interaction between executive control and language. Then most of the tracts have bilateral representation, and it is an open question of what it means for language reorganization due to brain damage. We know that some dorsal tract are more left lateralized, but still most of the associative language-related pathways are not. And which is the most important is a recent finding that in contrast to cortical areas, white matter tracts are characterized by reduced plasticity. That gives this is the basis for the notion of the so-called minimal common brain, which includes white matter tracts as the core anatomical system supporting language, which can change a little bit and make the cortical representations of language shift. But if these core elements, white matter tracts, are damaged, then the entire system, language system, is ruined. This is very important for, in particular, for neurosurgery patients, because as you can see here in green, these are different tumors in 3 different patients. So, and in this picture, the tumor is just sitting on a tract, on the fat here, and doesn't affect it. Here, it shifts the frontal ascending tract considerably to the motor regions. And here you can see a very huge tumor which shifts all the tracts, but still the tracts are not damaged. So they are shifted, the cortical representations are shifted. So if a neurosurgeon, in this case, if a neurosurgeon damages a tract, then the language is considerably affected. And in the same, following the same philosophy for intraoperative language mapping and white matter tract mapping, where and our colleagues suggesting different linguistic tasks to map these different tracts and to tap into their functions. For example, we see that, as I mentioned already, during the stimulation of the IFOF, we observe semantic paraphasias. During the stimulation of the acute fasciculus, we see phonological paraphasias and repetition errors. These are very different aspects of language. And of course, when you map and you try to tap into the function of the IFOF, repetition might not be the task of your choice. Right. So I refer you to this very important paper summarizing the hodological approach to language. And this is one of the first papers suggesting this approach. When specific linguistic and non-linguistic functions are related to specific white matter tracts, and the notion of the limits of white matter plasticity is discussed. And at the end of my talk, I would like to mention very interesting recent findings by some colleagues of us and by us ourselves, which suggest some addition to the hodological model of language. And you can take it as quite strong version for the moment, but I suggest you just think about that. That's about the anatomy, the structure, which might drive the function. There is a paper published basically in September, I think, this year, in Brain Communications, where they did transcranial magnetic stimulation in neurosurgical patients with tumors pre-operatively. So that was before any kind of resection. And with TMS, they found language positive sites, and then they overlaid, as we did for our intraoperative study, they overlaid these positive sites with tactography, and their positive sites were sitting exactly on the arcuate fasciculus, specifically on the anterior part of the lung and the anterior indirect segment, and in the Geschmidt territory. For some reason, in the temporal lobe, they were not very specific. So again, as in our study with the frontal island tract, in every individual patient, the anatomy was variable. The anatomy of the arcuate fasciculus was variable, but it was exactly what drives, it is exactly what drives the cortical representation of language, which was found with TMS. And some time ago, our group presented our recent data about the dominance of the arcuate fasciculus in people with different degree of handedness. So we found left dominance of the arcuate fasciculus in 94% of our 50 participants. And we also did fMRI localizer in these people with the sentence completion task, and we did tractography reconstructions. And there was no association found between the left lateralization of the arcuate fasciculus, which was very strong in the entire cohort, and their handedness, nor their functional lateralization for language. As you can see here, the functional, the representation of language was very variable in this cohort, but it didn't correlate at all with the strong, with the lateralization index of the arcuate fasciculus. But at the same time, of course, it is not just a coincidence that it is approximately the same percentage known in respect of aphasia occurrences. So about 95% of population, when a specific person gets a stroke, become aphasic if the stroke occurs in the left hemisphere. So for us, it means that fMRI maps we get, even with very exquisite linguistic tasks, are not sensitive to the language representation in the brain. And maybe the asymmetry of the white matter tract, the major language white matter tract, the arcuate fasciculus, is what is the most informative about individual language representation and lateralization. I would like to thank the audience and my entire lab. So the work I presented from my lab today was done by many of us. That's not only me. And of course, I would like to acknowledge our funding. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much, Olga. This is a fascinating and such a comprehensive overview.
I can't hear you well, Yuri.
Really nice. You can start by asking, just a second. Now, did you not hear me at all?
Yeah, it's better now.
Now
but
it is better, but it used to be pretty bad. Maybe you can
right.
turn
Yeah,
the camera off.
I started by thanking you for a comprehensive and fascinating overview
God.
of different data. That's really great. I'm really thankful for this. Maybe I could start with a basic question. Like there was at the time of the original Catani and others' work, uh, some 15 years ago, there was a lot of talk about differences between male and female brains in terms of arcuate laterality and cross-hemispheric connectivity. I think this was sort of put into it was question since. What do you know about that, or has there been any more research?
I know that further studies made with hundreds of participants did not confirm that.
Right. So basically, this was a false finding. Right. Okay. There is a question from Anna. Anna, please go ahead. Anna Krabas.
Thank you so much for this very interesting overview. I have a couple of questions. Maybe I can ask one first and then another.
Please go ahead.
So the first question concerns the arcuate fasciculus data. So usually we talk about arcuate fasciculus as connecting and transferring information from the temporal lobe to the frontal areas. But the data on that you showed on focal stimulation of the arcuate fasciculus and its potential involvement in well, the consequences of like the damage to the arcuate fasciculus with the conduction aphasia suggest that there is not only some like transfer from the temporal lobes to the frontal lobes, but there could be some bidirectional flow of information, because in order to repeat a word, for example, for somebody with a conduction aphasia, you have to not only rely on the feed forward mechanisms, but also on the feedback mechanisms, right? You have to keep the target, the sensory target in mind that you're trying to repeat, so try to emulate it, right? So that requires some like feedback processing. So like, I don't know data on that. Do you have anything like, is it like, does the flow only proceed in one direction from temporal to frontal lobe with terminations in the frontal lobe, or is it possible for the bidirectional transfer of information?
Mm-hmm. I believe that, and I guess most of the researchers working in this field believe that it's bidirectional. Maybe to be on the safe side, because we cannot tell, we cannot be sure, or because most of the processes in the brain are bidirectional, multidirectional, and of course these large pathways include axons going in both directions, right? So it can, I don't believe that's unidirectional. But on the other hand, I'm not aware of an intraoperative study supporting one view or the other. And I can imagine that it could be very difficult to design one. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, so my second question relates to that. If I can ask it later if other people want to go ahead.
Just go ahead.
So, I mean, the fasciculi are kind of long, right? And we usually talk about disrupting a function of the fasciculus. Like we know that, for example, simulating the arcuate fasciculus leads to dysarthric articulatory errors. And we also don't know much about how direct electric stimulation of the brain works, about how far the signal propagates along the pathway, for example. So like, does it matter then where you disrupt, where you simulate the fasciculus? Does it lead to, do we need more specificity? We're still talking about different fasciculi as fulfilling some functions, but does it also matter along the fasciculus, for example, where you stimulate or what area of the fasciculus you disrupt? Does that lead to different errors? Is there a dissociation along the the pathway. Is it legitimate to talk about just like them as serving one function? Maybe if you stimulate closer to the, for example, if you take our arcuate fasciculus and stimulate closer to the frontal areas, that will result in speech errors or articulatory errors. However, if you stimulate it or disrupt it closer to the temporal lobe, that's going to lead to different kinds of errors. Or like if you destimulate it, it disrupts like the whole fasciculus.
Right. So this is exactly the view of people who really work in the field. Of course, what I overviewed today is great simplification. This is basically similar to how Brock and Wernicke described their language model. Of course, every associative white matter tract I mentioned today consists of subcomponents, anatomical subcomponents, connecting different regions within those huge cortical areas. And I would even start with asking how these subcomponents of each tract are related to specific subfunction of the huge function we're discussing.
Right.
Because at different points of the huge associative tract, there could be different components coming to the surface and ready for stimulation. And we know that arcuate fasciculus, at least the contemporary model of the arcuate fasciculus already incorporates different segments. The ILF, actually, there are different proposals for the subcomponents of ILF, which you know that in our lab, for long we considered as a unitary tract. Now people see up to 5 subcomponents in the ILF only. And this about the frontal ascending tract, we know the proposal by Marco Catani about 3 branches of it to the coming to the premotor, SMA and pre-SMA, conducting very different functions, starting from core linguistic and finishing with very, very motor peripheral.
Okay, that's great. Since I don't do tractography, I was like wondering if people have started to dissociate different regions.
This is very fresh and recent, and this is what we're trying to do.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna.
Right. Any other questions, please? Raise your hand or just speak up. If you need more time to make up your questions, I can ask another one about the evolution of the tracts. There has been a lot of discussion of the arcuate fascicle being the most sort of a hallmark of language evolution in a way, right? So it's considerably differs between even our closest ape relatives and us. What about the other key tracts that you listed? What do we know about the evolution? Whether they can be seen as correlating with language function in any way, or are they more conservative?
Yes, this is a developing enterprise. The comparison of human language-related white matter tracts with what primates have, and so it is not even clear about the arcuate fasciculus, not even to go for other tracts, because as in newborns, the like what remains the arcuate fasciculus in primates is not fully myelinated, or is not as myelinated as in us, human adults. So I wouldn't say that we're ready to seriously discuss something other than the arcuate fasciculus for the moment. People try to do such comparisons, but well, I don't think that we can reconstruct. We can reconstruct the previous state of our hodological language model.
Right. Thank you. Anyone else? Been quiet. I have to say this was extremely clear and also novel to large parts of the audience, I suspect. I can see Olga has switched on her camera. Do you have a question? No?
No, just switching on. Just want to say that really can confirm Yuri's words that it was excellent and very clear and very unique.
Thank you very much for inviting